Karen had always acted like she owned Willow Creek, barking orders, nitpicking every little thing, and making life miserable for anyone who dared defy her rules. But nobody expected what happened next. Just like the infamous video of a mom kicked off a plane for her crying baby, Karen finally faced consequences she couldn't bully her way out of. Her arrogance, her tantrums, and her power trips were about to collide with a neighborhood that had quietly had enough. I moved into Willow Creek 3 years ago, seeking peace after the chaos of city life. The picket fences, quiet streets, and polite neighbors promised serenity. But Karen made sure the calm was always under siege. At first, her antics were subtle, a sharp word here, a nitpicky note there, but soon her true colors became impossible to ignore. The HOA wasn't just a board to her, it was her personal kingdom, and every homeowner a subject she could control. The first time I really noticed her was during the spring garden inspection. Mrs. Thompson, a sweet elderly widow, had planted tulips slightly taller than HOA guidelines allowed. Karen, red-faced and shaking with indignation, marched straight to her yard, waving a clipboard as if it were a sword. "This is unacceptable," she shrieked. "You are violating Section 7, Paragraph 2. Correct this immediately." Mrs. Thompson simply smiled, gently touching the flowers. "Karen, it's just tulips. They'll be gone in 2 weeks." Karen's jaw tightened. "Rules are rules," she hissed, storming off to write another formal notice. Neighbors whispered and exchanged glances. It was clear, Karen wasn't maintaining harmony, she was wielding power. Over the next months, her influence expanded. She manipulated board votes, subtly intimidated residents, and micromanaged every decision. A tilted mailbox, a gnome in a garden, even a slightly faded welcome mat could trigger a formal complaint. Arguments with Karen were futile. She always had bylaws memorized, quotes ready, and the patience of a hawk circling prey. I tried staying out of her crosshairs, focusing on my home and settling into the community. But everything changed the summer of the annual block party. The neighborhood was alive with music, kids running with ice cream cones, and the smell of barbecue filling the air. Laughter echoed across the street until Karen decided to intervene. "You can't have gatherings like this without prior approval," she shouted, striding up to the crowd like a general inspecting troops. Section 12, Clause 3. "You're all in violation." People froze, unsure if she was serious. The boldest among them, Mr. Patel, a retired engineer, raised an eyebrow. "Karen, it's just a block party," Karen glared. "Rules are rules, Mr. Patel." The tension thickened. You could almost hear the collective sigh of frustration from every resident who had endured her antics for years. That was when I realized something: Karen wasn't invincible. Every action she took, every threat she issued, only widened the gap between her and the community. People were tired of tiptoeing around her. And I, having observed her for years, knew it was only a matter of time before her own arrogance set the stage for her downfall. The turning point came unexpectedly. A neighbor, young Sarah Collins, had just adopted a baby. One afternoon, during a quiet lawn visit, the infant started crying. Karen happened to be passing by and immediately launched into a lecture. "Noise ordinances. This is disturbing the peace," she bellowed. Sarah tried to calm the baby, explaining that she was in her own yard, following every regulation. Karen, however, escalated, screaming, threatening fines, and waving her clipboard like a weapon. Several witnesses later compared her behavior to that viral plane incident, a mother punished for a child's natural cry. Everyone who saw it quietly laughed and sympathized with Sarah, but Karen had no idea how badly she had just exposed herself. Weeks went by, and whispers about the incident spread through the neighborhood. Parents talked about it during school pickups. Neighbors mentioned it at local cafes. Everyone had seen Karen overreach once too often, and the community's patience was fraying. It was no longer just a grudge, it was collective awareness that her behavior had gone too far. The board meetings, which once she dominated, started feeling different. Residents began showing up, quietly coordinating, preparing to stand against her tyranny. Meanwhile, I began taking notes. Not because I was nosy, but because I knew that Karen's arrogance was predictable. Her obsessions with rules and control, her impulsive reactions, and her inability to admit fault were all patterns. And patterns are exploitable. The opportunity arose during the HOA's midsummer board meeting. Karen was prepared to lecture everyone on community compliance and proper lawn decorum. What she didn't anticipate was the unity forming quietly among the residents. As she droned on, citing obscure bylaws and waving her clipboard with theatrical flair, a group of homeowners calmly presented documented evidence of her mismanagement, overreach, and abuse of board power. The evidence was detailed, precise, and irrefutable: numerous fines issued improperly, threatening letters, and documented harassment of residents. Karen's face turned a shade of red that no board member had ever seen. She tried to interrupt, to lecture, to intimidate, but every attempt was countered with facts, dates, and testimonies. The room, once tense and fearful, was now energized. Neighbors whispered encouragement to each other, some even chuckled openly at her sputtering. It was a rare sight, Karen, stripped of her assumed power, fumbling under scrutiny. By the time the vote came to decide her future on the board, the result was almost ceremonial. Unanimous. Karen was removed from her position, her authority officially revoked. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same woman who had compared minor infractions to legal violations now faced the full consequence of community action. She had, in effect, been kicked off the board just as that viral plane mom had been publicly shamed, exposed, powerless, and humiliated. But revenge stories, especially those that resonate, require more than just public embarrassment, they need poetic justice. That's where part 2 picks up. Karen's ego, so carefully nurtured over years of bullying, would face consequences far beyond mere removal from the board. Every complaint she ever filed, every unjust notice, and every rule she weaponized against others would return to her in ways she could never have anticipated. By the end of that meeting, the residents of Willow Creek felt a mix of relief and satisfaction. Peace, it seemed, was finally returning. But anyone who had been paying attention knew this wasn't just about Karen losing a title, it was about balance being restored, a reminder that control and tyranny, no matter how polished or persistent, always have limits. And while Karen stormed out, muttering about unfairness and bias, the neighborhood quietly celebrated, not with parties, but with the silent triumph of seeing justice done. The first battle had been won. But the ultimate satisfaction, the subtle yet undeniable poetic revenge that only a smartly plotted story could deliver, was still to come. Karen stormed out of the HOA meeting like a hurricane that had been momentarily stalled. Her heels clicked furiously against the polished floor, each step a manifestation of rage and disbelief. The board had stripped her of authority, but in her mind, the neighborhood owed her respect, compliance, and obedience. That evening, she posted an avalanche of complaints online, warning about corruption in the HOA and biased votes. But the residents, emboldened by the meeting, ignored her rants. They were tired of tiptoeing around her whims. Her power had crumbled, and the walls she built around herself were starting to fall. It was then I realized that removing her from the board was only half the victory. Karen's real weakness was her ego. She had spent years inflating it through intimidation, false authority, and selective enforcement of rules. To deliver true justice, we needed to turn her arrogance against her. I began quietly documenting every incident she had ever orchestrated: unjust fines, threats, and petty harassment. Every neighbor I spoke with provided corroborating stories, receipts, and photographs. The collection became a detailed dossier, a mirror reflecting Karen's true nature back at her. I also noticed something funny: Karen loved public attention. Whether at board meetings, neighborhood parties, or online forums, she thrived on being watched, envied, or feared. That gave me an idea. What if the same platform she used to dominate everyone could be the stage for her ultimate humiliation? Carefully, I coordinated with several neighbors. We prepared the community newsletter, emails, and even a small video montage, highlighting Karen's most absurd and petty actions. Everything was factual, documented, and impossible to dispute. It wasn't an attack, it was accountability in high definition. The next HOA meeting was calm at first, deceptively so. Karen arrived in her usual fashion, confident, clipboard in hand, smug expression firmly in place. She had clearly underestimated the community's resolve. As she began to speak, I subtly distributed copies of the compiled dossier to every attendee. Whispers began to ripple through the room. Karen noticed, finally realizing that the tide had turned. But it was too late. We presented the evidence calmly, fact by fact, date by date. Every unjust notice she had issued was cataloged, every overreach was highlighted. Even the incident with Sarah and her crying baby was included, not as ridicule, but as a glaring example of her obsession with control over human decency. Karen's face went pale, a mixture of panic and fury twisting her features. She tried to interrupt, but every attempt was met with polite resistance from the rest of the board. The more she tried to assert authority, the more the evidence undermined her. By the end of the presentation, her aura of invincibility was completely shattered. Residents, once timid in her presence, now spoke openly, each testimony building a wall of truth too solid for her ego to penetrate. When the final vote came to ratify additional community safeguards against abuse of power, Karen realized there was no room for argument. She was officially barred from influencing HOA decisions ever again. Her removal wasn't just symbolic. Bylaws were amended to prevent future unilateral actions by any board member, effectively neutralizing the possibility of another Karen taking control. The room erupted in quiet applause. For the first time in years, Willow Creek residents could breathe without fear of arbitrary fines or unprovoked harassment. But the real icing on the cake came a week later. Karen, never one to reflect on her actions, attempted to rally a few sympathizers. She sent frantic emails claiming defamation, unfair treatment, and even hinted at legal action. That was her mistake. By this time, we had anticipated her moves. A carefully drafted response, signed by multiple residents and reviewed by a local attorney, not only dismissed her claims but highlighted the documented evidence of her misconduct. Karen had officially boxed herself in, her threats lacked credibility, and her reputation had been irreversibly damaged. Socially, professionally, and within the community, she had no ground left to stand on. The poetic justice wasn't just in her public humiliation, it was in the subtle details that Karen would never anticipate. During the community's next newsletter, the cover story celebrated the unity and resilience of Willow Creek residents. It included photos of children playing, block parties, and communal projects, all juxtaposed with a small sidebar titled Lessons Learned, Accountability in Our Community. Karen's face, once the symbol of HOA tyranny, was referenced indirectly, highlighting her actions as cautionary tales without directly naming her in a negative tone. Anyone reading the newsletter would understand the message: abuse of power never goes unnoticed, and the neighborhood had collectively reclaimed its peace. Karen's final blow came from a source she had ignored for years: the neighbors themselves. Families she had bullied, residents she had intimidated, and even those she had publicly humiliated quietly reclaimed their spaces. Flower beds bloomed without fear of fines, mailboxes stood uncorrected, and lawn ornaments returned. Every small victory, mundane in isolation, formed a mosaic of resistance that underscored the futility of Karen's reign. She had tried to dominate, but the community had learned how to act together, and she was powerless to stop it. Weeks later, I ran into Karen at the local grocery store. She was alone, carrying a single basket, her eyes darting nervously as if expecting the world to judge her, as, indeed, it did. I nodded politely. She avoided eye contact. For the first time, she realized that her authority, her so-called kingdom, had evaporated. Willow Creek had moved on, thriving without her interference, and she was left a relic of her own ego. The satisfaction wasn't in gloating, it was in the quiet observation that justice, measured and patient, had been served. By the end of the summer, peace had returned to Willow Creek. The block parties went on, children laughed, and neighbors exchanged smiles without fear of Karen's interruptions. HOA meetings were productive, inclusive, and transparent. The lesson lingered: arrogance, bullying, and obsession with control might intimidate in the short term, but communities united in purpose will always restore balance. Karen had learned it the hard way, through public exposure, legal accountability, and the collective force of neighbors who refused to be bullied any longer. And as for the neighborhood, life continued. People planted their flowers, hosted their parties, and watched their children play freely. Karen's clipboard lay abandoned in her empty mailbox, a relic of a past era, a reminder that no one is above accountability. Willow Creek had reclaimed its heart, its peace, and its dignity. Justice, patient and clever, had been served, not with malice, but with logic, unity, and a little poetic irony. And that, in the end, was the sweetest victory of all. If you enjoyed seeing Karen finally get her comeuppance and the neighborhood reclaim its peace, don't forget to subscribe. Hit that button to catch more HOA stories, clever revenge tales, and unbelievable community drama. Trust me, you won't want to miss the next story of justice served in ways you'd never expect. Stay tuned and join our community for all the twists, turns, and satisfying payoffs.